Well, hello there, Professor Barry here. And this week number 7, continuation in sociology of advertising. And you're going to read this article this week. It's called "Who Takes the First Bite? A Critical Overview of Gender Representations in Food Advertising." Super interesting. Hope you find it interesting. And in your group discussion board, you're going to be providing some examples of food advertising that are demonstrating some of the ideas that are discussed in that article. Before you do your discussion board post, make sure you go out there to your group discussion board, look over to see who's posted, and look at the images that they include so that you try to minimize the duplications or trying to get the whole group. Everybody has a different example. If it happens to be like you go out there and you look, you see all the examples out there, and then you go do your search, takes a little while. By the time you get out and make your post, somebody else has already provide the same example. Don't worry about it. We're just trying to minimize the likelihood of that happening in some way. All right, so the goal of this shorter lecture is to orient you, to get you kind of like provide a context around the article and introduce you to some of the terminology. So you're going to be reading this article. It's an academic journal article. There's going to be a lot of technical jargon in there. The first part, especially, there's like the theoretical background, kind of like, okay, here's the research, here's what the academic work they're drawing from and putting together their analysis of food and advertising and gender. So there's a lot of like technical stuff. So this video, I want to provide some context and defining terminology so that you can kind of work through that first section a little bit easier. If you only get like 70% of that first section, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it too much. I think the second section, when they get into the application and the examples and illustrations, it's just so much easier to read. But anyway, so that's the goal. As you notice, okay, I'm wearing this hat. I bought this hat. We talk about a couple of different things about culture, right? Artifacts, part of culture. Study artifacts is a way of studying culture. This is, I bought this in Cuba years ago. There's no logo, there's no advertising. This was made, I'm 100% sure it was made there right outside of Havana. Somebody made it, some local person. And that's, it's an expression of that material structure. So, there's relatively little advertising in Cuba. It's it's oppositional to capitalism, although it's strong in terms of capitalism in the sense of like entrepreneurs doing work and doing things. So it's got elements of that. But anyway, so like this is just sort of an example of gender as well. So I can go float between that, and I'm going to change different hats during this short presentation. There's that hat. And then I'm going to put on this one. This one's one of my wife's hats. So I'm doing like this kind of sort of this idea of like doing gender, and we can talk about it. Maybe even that little stripe there signifying something about gender. So yeah, I'm going to switch hats as we kind of move through this discussion about gender. I'm going to start off. Here we go. All right, so let's start off terminology and kind of getting the backdrop to this article. Okay, so first theme here, let's separate off first sex and gender. Sex are those things that are biological aspects of who we are. And then there's the gendered component. So gender is social cultural factors. So we look at a person's sex, we're looking at their anatomy, anatomical parts, physiological self, things that's biologically distinct from male and female. This becomes a little bit challenging because our ideas of what our sex, what is sex, what goes into that box changes across time and place. So it's being shaped by our ideas of what is sex is being shaped by culture and values and those kind of things. So for example, some people, okay, never mind. So we kind of move into gender. So if sex is things that are like biological parts and aspects of who we are and making that distinction, then there's gender are the expectations that go along with being male or female. Gender is we talk about as a social construct. Ideas of gender are situated in culture and time and place. So, what does it mean to be male, to be female? What are those ideas? Those ideas are coming from social and cultural forces. They're variable across time and place. They're not determined by who we are essentially, but rather being shaped by kind of environment and context. So these are gendered ads, right? These aren't ads. These are not sex ads in advertising. Who takes a bite? And this is all about gender, representations of gender, ideas about being male and female. So that's gendered components. So gender roles, the expectations that go along with the position we occupy. Roles are those expectations. We have gendered roles, right? Expectations go along with being male and female. It's also intersectional. I probably should include that here as well to recognize that not only are gender, the gendered roles, the expectations, not only is this would be a male and female, but also being shaped by class, by race, by other parts of our experience. We have language, Steve, and our language and our ideas of gender have moved across time. We can see more recently in the last 10, 15 years, we talk about cisgender, transgender, cisgender, an individual's biological self, their sex aligns with their gender identity. And so we kind of get these components now. We sort of recognize even gender fluidity. We recognize that gender is maybe not like an on and off switch, but there's a lot more variability than we once recognized. I think we're recognizing more and more the diverse nature of gender within society itself. And then we also kind of address gender expression, or we'll talk about gender as a performance or doing gender. The last thing here is masculinities, masculinity or masculinities, same with femininities. And the IES is to signify, it's not masculinity only, but masculinities. That ideas about masculinity are part of that intersectional nature. So idea about being masculine, what goes into that box? Well, probably depends on your class position, educational background, region of the country, your age. I mean, so that's masculinities. So it's much more, it's not like a uniform thing that exists within culture, but it's being shaped by these other different parts of who we are. So these are just kind of some ideas about doing gender or different ideas about gender, right? This is like taking the pose, the female pose and the males posing in this position. It makes us kind of like, like laugh or funny or odd or quizzical. It disrupts us for a moment, right? It's like, that's not the expectation. It's not what we expect. It's not the role we expect of males, that overlay. Kind of like playing around with that sort of same idea too, gendered expectations, right? And sort of like, it's like, okay, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about gender. Okay, let's now talk about doing gender. I'm gonna put on another one of my wife's hats here, winter hat. I'm not sure if you can, is that a feminine? Is it masculine? Dramaturgy gets us into this idea that we do gender. And in the article, there's a lot of talk about references to a couple different researchers, Weston Zimmerman and to Butler, and their work is in this idea of doing gender. So to get into doing gender, let's talk about Goffman first, Irving Goffman. He's our interactional theorist, and he wrote a lot about basically the social interaction and a lot of different aspects of it. And one of the things that he's most well known for is this idea of dramaturgy. The presentation of self. And he has a sort of very Shakespearean idea, the world's a stage and we are merely players, we are actors on a stage, and there's an interaction between the actor and the audience. So gender is a performance. Gender is something that we engage in, that we do gender. It's something that we practice. There's a script that goes along with gender. The script is, the language, what we say, how we engage in conversation. There's a script with that. And you start to think about the language that we use. For example, cuss words and male and female, the expectations male and female in terms of cuss words, and what does that mean? If you were to say a cuss word, if you're male or female, given a certain context. So that's part of the script, like what we're supposed to say, how we communicate, like that's a learned thing. And there's a dramaturgical component that it's a presentation of self, that we're the actor and we're interacting with an audience. And Goffman would say this isn't a fake sense of who we are or an inauthentic sense of who we are. It's like, no, it's like we are humans or performers. We're performers on stage. So you change the stage, change the performance, change the audience, change the performance. Actors like adjusting to these kind of different elements. So you have the script, you have the costume, right? This becomes part of the costume, like what we wear is part of that. Do we have a script? We have a costume. We have the performance on the stage. We have what Goffman called backstage when we're not on the stage. So just like breaking this idea down that we have, when we're getting into dramaturgy and doing gender, it's something that we practice, it's something we do, it's something that we demonstrate, and it's through our clothes, through our language, through our demeanor, through our habits, the foods that we like, right? So eating meat, and this sort of discussion in the article, eating meat and masculinity. It's like, okay, if you eat tofu, I mean, this could be very culturally situated as well, right? So eating, being vegan, being vegetarian, like what does that mean in terms of our cultural notions of masculinity? And if it's through what we consume, we're demonstrating our gendered self. Some ways in which we perform gender in terms of our habits of what we eat may contradict larger cultural values of things like masculinity. So there's, I don't know, different things. You know, think about advertising is never determining any reality. I think you can study advertising to understand kind of cultural things that are going on. Advertisements are a reflection of changes that are going on in culture. They also have the power to reinforce culture. So it's this kind of reflecting culture. If we go way back to the first part of the term, right? Idealism, and it's kind of the cultural diamond, right? So like it's reflecting reality, at the same time it's creating reality as well. So representations, advertisements may shape the way that we view the world, may shape our practice, and they're also reflections of the broader world. Self-determination is important to recognize we all have agency. And in the article, I talk about that humans, we all have agency. We make decisions how to interact in this space. We don't all perform the role of our gendered role the same way. Even within our own class and our own race and our own educational background and experience, we don't all perform it in the same way. So we all have agency in how we navigate that space. I'm going to provide, I don't know, just give you this example, not worry about the language, but I just thought it was an opportunity to bring up that whole, the discussion about cancel culture, and recognize that culture is shifting, right? So culture shifts always, it's moving, sometimes more dynamic than others. So our language, our representations may change as we go on in terms of, as we move forward, as things change across time. These are kids' books, Richard Scarry books, and you see that the old form was things like The Jumping Gentleman, The Damsel, the Beautiful, Screaming Lady versus A Cat in Danger. So firefighter, you know, here's the fireman, or is it the brave hero, and then we have the firefighter, more gender neutral. So this is more contemporary. We could do the same for looking at the pretty stewardess versus the flight attendant. So this isn't, this is not about cancel culture. This is about culture shifting. Our language is shifting. Our representations are shifting. Now, the odd thing is, that's already like the feminist movement, the 1970s, expansion of women into politics, economics, gender roles changing in society, a lot of things that are going on. There's like this crisis of masculinity that starts to develop. We start to develop this sort of idea about hypermasculinity. It kind of emerges where the male body is sort of like becomes a hypermasculine form. Maybe I should have presented some information on this, but it's kind of interesting. Like we're moving towards greater starting the 1970s, until the 1980s, is sort of move towards greater gender equity, or at least conversations about gender equity. And at the same time, we get this gendered further entrenchment of separating out more and more of our lives in terms of like pink and blue, or pink and purple, and black and blue. So advertising and marketing becomes sort of like this bifurcated world in a lot of ways, especially for kids stuff, which is really interesting. Starting with the 1980s, and there's a lot of reasons you can get it. This is like the production of culture kind of aspect from our cultural studies tradition. But when I was a kid growing up, you didn't go down a toy aisle. You could see like there's certain toy aisles be like, okay, that's more boy, that's more girl toys, whatever that means down those aisles. But this marketing, the colors, the sparkle, I mean, like this laying out of the store aisles is such a different experience and the use of color in that way, and even the language of toys. And there's been a lot of academic work on this kind of stuff about, reinforcing particular ideas of masculinity and femininity, and, where are boys and girls, they have to learn, they're learning the script of doing gender, right? And where do they learn that? They learn it from a lot of places, not only the marketplace, but they learn it from home and school. I mean, a lot of different places. But, they also learn it from, their physical participation in a store, right? And if kids are buying and consuming in these kind of ways too, and then they go to school with consuming these ways, and they're reinforcing these particular ideas about gender as well. This is a comparative piece. In 1970s, there was things like Legos, much more gender neutral. You have here's appliances, a boy playing, he's engaging with this appliance, household appliance, but there was much more gender neutrality in terms of advertising, or things weren't advertising. We didn't have the commodities like we do now, that a male and female version of that commodity. Like, for example, razors, right? So razors, like there's sort of the pink, everything, pink, taking a product and then turning it into male and female product, that product. A Bic pen, which I found that was really interesting. Like we're coding Bic pens. It's just a writing instrument, right? So more and more gendered aspects of those kind of things. But there's been some backlash against that. Some of it has been like, okay, so places like Toys R Us, they're moving away from boys' toys and girls' toys, like that gendered separation, and putting things out in a different way. So there's a long discussion to get at. Like, all this stuff is reinforcing or helping to establish these ideas of what that script is, and that sort of cultural notions of gender, of masculinity and femininity. All right, so theme number 2, doing food in gendered ways. So that article is, I thought it's so interesting. When I drive around town, sometimes I look at a fast food restaurant, oftentimes, because it's like, because I have big advertisements in their windows, and I'll see things that just represent this idea of doing gender. And you'll see them too, as you kind of start to look around for advertisements. These 2 images here are not about food, but it's like, okay, I'll just, rather than taking images that you might look at or see and include in your discussion board, I figured I'll just take household cleaning. And, this is a script, right? Femininity and ideas of femininity, idea of gender roles. We get to the historical time period. Him saying to her, you certainly clean up fast these days, like this 1950s kind of advertising, white middle class, suburbia kind of notion. Then you get this sort of like, this is that hypermasculine male body in a way, and she's like, he becomes, there's this gaze component that you read about a little bit in the article, the gaze, that we're imagining how other people are seeing us, and we're also gazing at these objects. So it's this process of learning that's going on through this sort of the subject of looking at the subject, or imagining how the subject is viewing us. So this is like gender performance, to be a house cleaner, to clean the house, and you're male. It's like you get to do it in a very masculine kind of way, this sort of doing gender. So let's kind of go take a couple different terms. So we're going to just bring them forward. Think about culture, right? Is the beliefs, values, practice, the things that are going on. That's like that defining culture. We kind of recall back the podcast earlier in the term. And then we get into popular culture, those things that are relatively common, that are circulated around mass culture, the things that are practices, they're commodities that are being circulated. So it's a little bit different than just thinking about the broad culture, but then we think about that sort of like a niche of popular culture versus sort of like, so it's this mass culture versus high culture. And advertising belongs in that popular culture space. And then we can kind of look at it from a functionalist viewpoint. The images that we see in the representation are a reflection of our cultural values, that cultural diamond, that idealism. From a conflict theory perspective, is that these ideas are reinforcing ideas of inequalities, that patriarchy, ideas of masculinity and femininity that are reinforcing these ideas. And then we can also look at interactionism, how these representations are shaping the ways that we think about the social world as well. And I think all 3 of those have some good food for thought to kind of like, they're not advertising, they're part of our visual landscape. They are an influence on our culture and us. So the question is like, so it's like try to engage in that and try to understand that versus just thinking about it as entertainment or meaningless kind of stuff. It's like there's power in imagery and the symbolic world. It also like kind of gets us into Gramsci's hegemony, domination by consent, or the soft power kind of thing, controlling our bodies, controlling our thoughts, superstructure, right? So controlling our ideas through advertising, controlling ideas about gender, shaping ideas about gender, reinforcing particular ideas about gender that help to establish or maintain inequalities that are going on. We bring forward Bourdieu's idea about habitus, right? About how our social position, what we learn, what we do, the way that we do gender, for example, could be related to our social position. It's a socially learned thing. It's a cultural capital thing that we develop in terms of knowing what the right, knowing cultural capital, the things that we have, the things that we know, the things that we can exchange in the marketplace. If we have this capital, right, this cultural capital, it's a way of demonstrating our social position. Then we can kind of get into that gaze, and we're imagining, looking at an advertisement. The gaze idea is that we are looking at objects and imagining ourselves as part of that object. We're imagining life from that person's perspective or that character's perspective. So there's this sort of like the male gaze, like imagine this sort of the male eyes looking at that advertisement, the female gaze. It's also class, race dimensions to the gaze. And then finally, just bringing forward this sort of idea of like, we could look at these advertisements through a lens of, globalization or movement across culture and area and region, where you have certain ideas about gender and food may move across areas within a nation, rural to urban. How do things kind of move in terms of cultural practices and ideas? Look at a larger level, cultural leveling, things become more the same. So advertising may have a sort of a particular impact on cultural leveling or domination, right? This cultural imperialism. So when advertising and products are moving around the world, so for example, like the pink razors and pink pens, not only it's the pens that are moving and the razors are moving, but it's this idea of genderifying all these different kind of components, which is probably a pretty powerful dimension of things that are being transformed that way. Okay, and then finally is we could bring our cultural studies idea forward, right? So we could be looking at these gendered ads. We could be looking at the advertising industry, the production of advertising, the political economy of advertising, the technologies that are available. Like that's part of the dimension. What we're looking at in this article that you're reading about is really about the text analysis. It's taking all these advertisements, looking at them, examining them, and then, on page 321, right? They come up with this diagram here, these different gender types, women and men, women like the domestic juggler, the yummy goddess, the hedonic vamp, men, the breadwinning, nurturing father, domestic diva, wild bachelor, like those characteristics, right? So this is they're doing a textual analysis. They're looking at all these different advertisements and looking for patterns. And then they're trying to categorize these particular patterns. So that's a text analysis, but where they're not really engaged in as much, they're not engaged in the audience reception. So remember, like audience reception is your social position may shape how, and social position and the setting in which you're viewing something may shape how you view, how you interpret or how you interact with the text. So how you receive it. So you could, like you're looking at an advertisement and you see something. Again, it's not like an advertisement changes like boom. It could, but changes somebody's behavior or their ideas. It's more about the broader cultural landscape that we are in and sort of how we as audience members kind of like interact with these texts, the meaning that we assign to them, how we engage with them. And so audience reception, male, female, male, certain class, female, certain class, all these different dimensions, all those different social positions shape our audience reception. I mean, how much we accept it, how much we resist it, I mean, if I go back to sort of earlier principle, advertising has an influence, otherwise we wouldn't have advertising. So the question is of degree and how and what way, but not only does it have an influence in terms of our consumption, but the question is how much does it have an influence over our own identities or our own sense of self and our view of other. So I'm going to put a quote here to kind of get this a little bit. This is on page 320, the first paragraph. As mentioned in the introduction, the way gender is depicted in advertising is never neutral, but it represents an intervention in our world, an intervention that's driven by culture, social forces, political forces, economic forces. When it comes to gender roles, advertising replicates and magnifies social inequalities, normative behaviors, and related moral sanctioning. So these advertisements are not like this like neutral, innocent thing. They're reinforcing dynamics of culture, things that are there. And some of those things that are being reinforced are social inequalities. And it's really kind of hard to see, maybe like where you kind of go, it's just an advertisement, man, come on, what's going on? But you start to put in that larger cultural soup of all these different representations and images and stuff that we see, you start to go, there's a pattern going on here, and a pattern, you know, as we engage in the world of patterns and things that are happening, start to go, let's think there's something going on here. What is the degree of influence? We all have agency. We all engage with things in different ways. So we're all that audience reception, that human agency is important, but doesn't mean, but we have to also recognize that these things have a lot of influence. And it's the question of how and what ways. Food advertising is particularly interesting in this respect, as it often displays extreme gender polarization. And I'm just going to end with this, like a couple of examples. Don't include these in your post, but it's like this, you know, real men masculinity pulling up this car, skinny jeans, you know, lean cuisine, even like the font and the text, right? Very feminine, very soft, you know, colors. You know, like this is the textual analysis kind of thing. Everybody loves big breasts. I mean, like, look at what is going on? Hungry man, triple size, triple or double XL. You know, it's like these ideas of masculinity and femininity sort of wrapped up in that kind of stuff. Super interesting, fun. Hope you enjoy it. Yeah, looking forward to looking at your examples and illustrations. Feel free to jump outside of the United States too. It doesn't have to be in the United States, but if you find something from a different country, from Russia, from Central America, South America, wherever it may be, just say that this is from this country. We may not be able to have the same filter to be able to interpret that, but if there's a gendered component there, it's like, yeah, just talk about it and say where it comes from. It'd be interesting to see that. And then just a heads up, for the next couple of weeks, we're moving, like next week, we're moving on to branding. And then we start moving into consumption for basically the last couple of weeks, and then we end up with media influence. All right, so that's it. No more hacks for today. Yeah, have a great day, and enjoy the reading and discussion board posts, and have a good day.